There's a question that almost everyone who has been hurt by a narcissist eventually asks, usually late at night, usually in a moment of exhausted reflection, and it's this. Does he actually feel anything at all after what he did? Or is he simply as fine as he appears to be, moving through his life with the same ease as always, completely untouched by the damage he left behind? This question matters more than it might seem, because the answer shapes how you understand your own experience, how you make sense of the confusing gap between what you lived through and how little consequence it seems to have carried on the other end. Today, I want to walk you through what actually happens inside a narcissist after they've hurt someone, what they genuinely feel underneath the performance of indifference, and why understanding this hidden internal experience changes how you relate to the silence that so often follows. Let's start with something that needs to be established clearly, because it reframes the entire conversation. The absence of visible remorse is not the same thing as the absence of internal disturbance. This distinction matters enormously because so much of the pain that follows a relationship with a narcissist comes specifically from watching them appear unaffected, appear to move on effortlessly, appear to carry no weight at all from something that left you devastated. This apparent ease is almost never the full picture. What's actually happening beneath that composed surface is significantly more complicated, more conflicted, and in many cases, more uncomfortable for them than their outward presentation would ever suggest, precisely because acknowledging that discomfort would require confronting something their entire psychological architecture is built to avoid. The first thing worth understanding is what actually happens in the immediate aftermath of a narcissist causing genuine harm, because the sequence rarely matches what most people assume. In the very first moments, before any defense mechanisms have had time to fully engage, there's often a flicker of something real, a brief, unguarded registration that something significant just happened, that a line was crossed, that damage occurred. This flicker is usually extremely short-lived, sometimes lasting only seconds, because a narcissist's psychological structure is specifically organized to intercept this kind of unguarded awareness before it can develop into something requiring genuine accountability. But the flicker itself matters, because it tells us something important. The capacity to register harm exists, even if what happens immediately afterward prevents that registration from ever developing into full, conscious remorse. The second thing to understand is what happens to that flicker once the defense mechanisms fully engage, which typically happens within moments rather than the extended internal battle you might expect. The most common pathway involves rapid reframing, where the narcissist's mind, almost automatically, begins constructing a version of events that redistributes responsibility away from their own behavior. You provoked it. You're overreacting. This wouldn't have happened if you'd simply done what was reasonable to expect. This reframing isn't typically a slow, deliberate process of rationalization. It happens with startling speed, often so quickly that the narcissist genuinely experiences the reframed version as their authentic memory of events almost immediately, which is exactly why they can present that version so convincingly afterward. Not because they're consciously lying in that moment, but because the rewriting has already happened by the time they're describing what occurred. The third thing worth understanding is that this rapid reframing doesn't actually eliminate the underlying disturbance. It simply relocates it somewhere the narcissist has much less conscious access to. This is one of the most important and least understood aspects of narcissistic psychology, and it explains a great deal about behavior that otherwise seems contradictory. If reframing genuinely eliminated the internal disturbance, you wouldn't expect to see the specific patterns that so often follow instances of real harm: increased irritability in unrelated contexts, disrupted sleep they can't quite explain, a subtle uptick in defensive behavior even in interactions that have nothing to do with what happened, sometimes even physical symptoms like tension or unexplained fatigue. These patterns suggest that something is still being processed, still creating internal friction, even though the conscious narrative has already been successfully rewritten into something more comfortable to hold. The fourth thing to understand involves what psychologists sometimes describe as split awareness, the capacity to hold two contradictory internal states simultaneously without fully integrating them into a single, coherent understanding. A narcissist who has caused real harm often exists internally in exactly this kind of split state. On one level, consciously, the reframed narrative dominates. They were justified, you were unreasonable, nothing particularly wrong occurred. On another level, one they rarely access directly and almost never articulate, even to themselves, something closer to genuine discomfort persists, showing up not as clear guilt, but as diffuse unease, a background hum of something unresolved that they've become extremely skilled at not looking at directly. This split isn't necessarily conscious deception. It's more like two separate rooms in the same house, one they live in openly and one they've learned, over years of practice, to keep the door closed on almost entirely. The fifth thing worth exploring is why this specific psychological structure developed in the first place, because understanding the origin doesn't excuse the behavior, but it does explain why the pattern is so consistent and so resistant to change. Many narcissists developed this capacity for rapid reframing and split awareness as children, in response to environments where acknowledging fault led to consequences severe enough that avoidance became a matter of genuine psychological survival. Harsh punishment, withdrawal of love, public humiliation, or simply an environment where being wrong meant losing something they couldn't afford to lose. Over years of repetition, this avoidance became so deeply automatic that by adulthood, it no longer requires conscious effort at all. The rapid reframing we discussed earlier isn't a choice made freshly each time harm occurs. It's a deeply grooved neural pathway activated almost instantly, precisely because the alternative, genuinely sitting with the awareness of having caused harm, was, at some earlier point in their development, associated with a level of threat their nervous system decided was never safe to risk again. The sixth thing to understand is what specifically happens when a narcissist encounters evidence that directly contradicts their reframed narrative, evidence they can't easily dismiss or explain away, a message you saved, a pattern too consistent to attribute to your oversensitivity, another person confirming what you experienced. This is often when the split awareness we discussed becomes briefly, uncomfortably visible, even to them. In these moments, some narcissists experience what looks, from the outside, like sudden defensiveness disproportionate to the evidence itself, an intense, immediate need to discredit the source, minimize the significance, or redirect attention elsewhere as quickly as possible. This disproportionate reaction isn't really about the specific piece of evidence, it's about how close that evidence comes to forcing open the door between the two rooms we discussed, and the intensity of the defensive reaction is often directly proportional to how much genuine disturbance exists behind that door, waiting to surface if the door were ever actually allowed to open fully. The seventh thing worth understanding, and this one deserves particular attention because it explains a pattern many people find deeply confusing, is what happens specifically at night, in isolated, unstructured moments when the usual external distractions and defense-supporting activities aren't available to occupy their attention. Sleep disruption, restlessness, and unexplained heaviness that surfaces specifically in quiet, solitary moments. These patterns show up with notable frequency in people who've caused significant harm and successfully avoided conscious accountability for it during their waking, socially engaged hours. This isn't proof of deep remorse in any conventional sense. It's better understood as evidence that the disturbance we've been discussing throughout this conversation doesn't actually disappear simply because it's been successfully avoided during the day. It goes somewhere, and unstructured, quiet time, without the usual distractions available to keep the reframed narrative comfortably in place, is often exactly where it resurfaces, briefly, uncomfortably, before the usual defenses reassert themselves again with the arrival of morning and its accompanying distractions. This isn't proof of deep remorse in any conventional sense. It's better understood as evidence that the disturbance we've been discussing throughout this conversation doesn't actually disappear simply because it's been successfully avoided during the day. It goes somewhere, and unstructured quiet time, without the usual distractions available to keep the reframed narrative comfortably in place, is often exactly where it resurfaces. Briefly, uncomfortably, before the usual defenses reassert themselves again with the arrival of morning and its accompanying distractions. And this is exactly where I want to take the rest of our conversation, because understanding what happens inside them is only valuable if it also changes something about how you carry what happened to you. And I want to walk through that carefully, honestly, without either overstating what this internal disturbance actually means or dismissing its significance entirely. The first thing worth addressing directly is a question that tends to follow naturally from everything we've discussed so far. If some form of internal disturbance genuinely exists, why doesn't it ever translate into the accountability, the apology, the acknowledgement you might reasonably hope for? This is one of the most important distinctions to understand clearly, because conflating internal disturbance with a capacity for genuine accountability leads to a specific, damaging kind of hope. The hope that if you just wait long enough, if the disturbance is real, surely it will eventually surface into something you can actually witness, something that finally validates what you experienced. I need to be honest with you about why this hope, however understandable, usually doesn't materialize the way you'd want it to. The disturbance we've been discussing operates almost entirely outside conscious access, precisely because conscious access to it would require dismantling defense mechanisms that took an entire childhood to construct and have been reinforced through decades of successful avoidance since. The discomfort existing doesn't mean the pathway to expressing it exists. Those are two entirely separate psychological achievements, and possessing one doesn't guarantee eventual access to the other, no matter how much time passes. The second thing worth understanding is why this specific insight, that they do feel something, even if it never surfaces into visible accountability, matters for your healing anyway, even without the resolution you might have hoped it would provide. So much of the pain that follows these relationships comes from a very specific, very painful interpretation of their apparent ease. The conclusion that what happened to you simply didn't matter, wasn't significant enough to leave any real mark, was perhaps even something you're remembering as more serious than it actually was, precisely because the person responsible seems so entirely unbothered by it. Understanding the reality of split awareness, of rapid reframing, of disturbance relocated to inaccessible internal spaces offers a different, more accurate interpretation. What happened mattered enough to require this elaborate psychological architecture just to avoid facing it. Ease of this magnitude doesn't develop around events that were genuinely insignificant. It develops specifically around events serious enough to require serious defensive machinery, and recognizing this can help you release the specific, corrosive belief that your pain was somehow disproportionate to what actually happened. The third thing to understand is how to relate to this knowledge without letting it become a new form of the same weighting you're trying to move past. This distinction is subtle but important. Understanding that they likely experience some form of internal disturbance is different from waiting for that disturbance to eventually produce something you can witness or receive. The first is simply accurate information about human psychology, something you can hold quietly, privately, as part of a more complete understanding of what happened. The second is a continuation of the same hope that likely kept you in the relationship longer than was healthy. The hope that enough evidence, enough time, enough patience would eventually unlock something that was never actually going to unlock, at least not on any timeline you could reasonably wait for. Holding this knowledge without converting it back into hope for their eventual transformation is genuinely difficult, and it requires ongoing, deliberate practice rather than a single moment of understanding that resolves the pull permanently. The fourth thing worth exploring is what this understanding actually offers you, practically, in terms of how you carry the relationship forward in your own memory and self-concept. One of the most persistent forms of damage that follows relationships with narcissists is a kind of retroactive self-doubt, a creeping uncertainty about whether your perception of events was accurate, whether you're remembering things worse than they actually were, whether the calm, unaffected version of them you witnessed afterward is somehow more reliable evidence of what actually happened than your own lived experience of it. Understanding the mechanics of rapid reframing and split awareness gives you a framework for holding on to your own account with more confidence, not because you need external validation to know what you experienced, but because understanding why their account differs so dramatically from yours, not because your account is wrong, but because theirs has been actively, unconsciously rewritten, restores some of the certainty that their apparent calm was specifically designed, whether consciously or not, to erode. The fifth thing, and this one requires real honesty about the limits of what psychological understanding can actually offer, is recognizing that even complete, accurate understanding of everything we've discussed today doesn't obligate you to extend continued compassion, patience, or access to someone simply because you now understand the mechanics of what's happening inside them. Understanding a pattern is not the same thing as excusing it, and it's certainly not an argument for continued proximity to someone whose demonstrated behavior, regardless of what internal disturbance might exist beneath it, caused you genuine, significant harm. You are allowed to understand exactly why someone does what they do while still, simultaneously, deciding that understanding doesn't change your own boundaries, your own safety, your own right to distance yourself from continued exposure to that pattern. Compassion for the origin of a behavior and continued tolerance of that behavior's consequences are two entirely separate decisions, and conflating them is exactly the trap that keeps so many empathetic people cycling back into relationships that understanding alone was never going to make safe. I want to talk now about something that deserves genuine attention, because it represents the actual difference between how a narcissist processes this internal disturbance and how you, presumably someone without the same defensive architecture, would process something similar if the roles were reversed. If you caused genuine harm to someone you cared about, your own psychology would likely move toward integration rather than avoidance. You'd feel the discomfort directly, allow it to inform genuine reflection, probably experience real guilt that motivates actual behavioral change or, at minimum, honest acknowledgement. This capacity for integration, uncomfortable as it is in the moment, is actually a sign of psychological health, not a burden to resent yourself for carrying. The narcissist's apparent freedom from this discomfort isn't evidence of superior emotional resilience or genuine peace. It's evidence of an entirely different, much less healthy relationship with accountability, one that trades short-term comfort for a permanent inability to actually learn, grow, or repair what's been damaged. Their ease, in other words, isn't something to envy or resent. It's simply the visible symptom of a much deeper, unresolved difficulty they've organized their entire psychology around never having to face directly. This brings me to something important about how to think about your own healing in light of everything we've discussed. You do not need their internal disturbance to ever surface into visible form in order for your own healing to be complete. This is one of the hardest things to fully internalize because some part of almost everyone who's been hurt this way holds on to a quiet hope that eventual acknowledgement, however small, however delayed, might still arrive someday. I want you to understand that building your healing around that possibility keeps you tethered to their internal process, a process you have no access to and no ability to influence, rather than building your healing around what's actually within your control, your own understanding, your own boundaries, your own continued growth away from a dynamic that required so much of your energy to simply survive. I also want to address something that comes up often in this exact conversation, The question of whether knowing this internal disturbance exists should soften your anger, your grief, your continued difficulty forgiving what happened. I don't think it should, necessarily. And I don't think you're obligated to feel differently about what happened, simply because you now understand more about the psychology underneath it. Anger and grief are legitimate, proportionate responses to genuine harm, regardless of what internal complexity exists inside the person who caused it. Understanding doesn't require forgiveness, and it certainly doesn't require you to feel sorry for someone whose defensive architecture, however painfully constructed in their own childhood, was ultimately deployed against you in ways that caused real, lasting damage. You're allowed to hold both truths simultaneously, that they likely experienced some genuine internal disturbance, and that this disturbance doesn't owe you anything, doesn't obligate your continued patience, and doesn't diminish the legitimacy of whatever you're still feeling about what happened. So picture this, the way we often close these conversations, not a dramatic scene where the narcissist finally publicly breaks down, finally reveals the internal disturbance we've spent this entire conversation examining, because that revelation, as satisfying as it might feel to imagine, is genuinely unlikely to ever arrive in a form you get to witness. Picture something quieter instead, something that actually belongs entirely to you rather than depending on anything happening within them. Picture yourself somewhere in your own ordinary life, no longer waiting for a confession that was never actually coming, no longer measuring your own healing against whether they ever seemed to suffer proportionately to what they caused you to suffer. Picture yourself simply, finally, understanding the full mechanics of what happened, not just what they did, but why their apparent ease afterward was never actually evidence that it didn't matter, and feeling something settle inside you that doesn't require their acknowledgement in order to feel complete, because that is the real, quiet, cinematic truth beneath everything we've explored today. Somewhere, in a version of his life you'll likely never fully witness, something genuinely disturbed by what happened between you continues to exist, quietly, defended against, relocated somewhere just out of his own conscious reach, surfacing occasionally in restless nights and unexplained tension he'll probably never trace back to its actual source. But that disturbance was never actually yours to wait for, was never something your healing needed in order to be real, was never proof you required in order to trust what you already, fully, completely know to be true. You don't need him to feel it visibly. You already know it's there. And that knowledge, quiet and complete and entirely independent of anything he ever chooses to show you, is more than enough.